The warm afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the chapel, casting a kaleidoscope of colors on the polished wooden pews. Guests filled the small space, their voices a hushed murmur as they exchanged excited glances. All eyes were turned toward the altar, where David Matthews, dressed in a crisp black tuxedo, stood with a broad smile. His eyes sparkled, a hint of nervousness evident as he waited for his bride. At his side stood his 8-year-old son, Ethan, holding a small velvet pillow that cradled the wedding bands. Ethan's miniature suit matched his father's, his dark curls neatly combed, and he looked every bit the perfect ring-bearer. Yet, a sharp observer might have noticed the tension in his stance, the way his fingers dug into the edge of the pillow or how his gaze darted not toward the chapel doors, but at his father, unwavering and serious. "You look great, Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. His father, catching the nervousness in his son's tone, glanced down with a warm smile. "Thanks, buddy," David replied, ruffling Ethan's hair. "I couldn't ask for a better wingman than you." The boy forced a smile, but his chest felt tight. Something gnawed at him, something he could no longer ignore. A hush fell over the guests as the first notes of the wedding march began, and all eyes turned toward the grand wooden doors. With a slow creak, they opened, revealing Emily a vision in white lace, her golden hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, a radiant smile lighting up her face. She looked beautiful, an image straight out of a fairy tale. But while the guests gasped at the sight, Ethan's gaze remained fixed on his father. He could hear the whispers around him, but he felt an urgency thrumming in his chest, a pressing weight that had been growing over the past few weeks. One he tried to ignore for his father's sake. Today, though, it was impossible to ignore. Emily walked gracefully down the aisle, her eyes locked on David, her smile softening as she reached his side. David's face shone with pure joy, and he leaned forward, whispering, "You look beautiful." "Thank you, David," she replied, her voice barely audible, her blue eyes gleaming with emotion. "I can't wait to start our life together." The officiant cleared his throat, calling everyone's attention as the ceremony began. His words floated through the chapel, weaving a sacred rhythm, but to Ethan, they felt distant, almost dreamlike. His mind drifted back to a night months earlier, a night he'd tried to forget. A conversation he'd overheard, a cold, sharp tone in Emily's voice when she thought she was alone. Ethan's grip on the pillow tightened until his knuckles turned white. He thought of how his dad had laughed more in the past few months than he had in years, how the house felt brighter with Emily's presence. But he also remembered her cold stares when his father wasn't looking, the harsh words she saved just for him. He remembered the night he'd overheard her on the phone, talking about a plan he couldn't fully understand, but he understood enough to know it was dangerous and it involved his father. "Ethan," his father whispered, noticing his son's pale face. "Are you all right, buddy?" The boy looked up, meeting his father's eyes, brimming with concern. He opened his mouth, words hovering on his tongue, the ones he'd rehearsed 100 times in his head but could never quite bring himself to say. He wanted to warn him, to tell him everything, but the moment was slipping away as the officiant spoke louder, nearing the pivotal question. "If anyone here can show just cause why this couple cannot be lawfully joined in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." A silence descended, so thick that it felt almost tangible, pressing down on Ethan's chest. The words he'd been afraid to say, the secret he'd held onto in the hopes that maybe he was wrong, seemed to swell in his throat, desperate to be released. He saw his father's hopeful gaze, his trust, his love, and then he looked at Emily, who returned his stare with something cold, something that made his blood run cold. He knew in that instant he couldn't stay silent any longer. "Wait," the word burst from Ethan's lips, startling everyone. A collective gasp rippled through the room, and all eyes turned to the small boy standing at the altar. Trembling but resolute, David looked at him, confusion and worry darkening his eyes. "Ethan," he whispered, bending down. "What's wrong?" Ethan swallowed, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, the judgment, the disbelief, but he pushed it all aside, locking his gaze on his father. "You can't marry her, Dad," he said, his voice small but unwavering. She's not who you think she is. The silence that followed was so profound that Ethan could hear the soft ticking of the clock in the chapel. He took a deep breath. And with all the courage he could muster, he began to reveal the secrets he had carried alone. Ethan's voice hung in the air like a shiver, his words rippling through the crowd as shocked gasps and whispered confusion swept over the guests. David, frozen in place, knelt down to his son's level, his face etched with both love and deep concern. The guests shifted uncomfortably, craning to hear as Ethan took a trembling breath. "Buddy, what's going on?" David's voice was a soft plea, his eyes searching Ethan's face for any sign of clarity. Ethan clenched his hands around the small pillow he'd been holding, 1,000 thoughts battling in his mind. This was his chance to tell his father everything, to finally speak the truth he'd held tightly for weeks. But would his dad believe him? How could he make anyone see what he'd seen? What he'd endured alone? David's fiancée, Emily, looked on with an expression of bewilderment, her mouth slightly open, as though she couldn't believe the interruption was real. A flicker of something else, annoyance, passed across her face, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by an almost motherly concern as she looked at Ethan. "Ethan, sweetheart," she said with forced warmth, her voice sickly sweet. "This is a big day for all of us. And I know it must be overwhelming." She cast a sympathetic glance at David, as though sharing in some unspoken understanding. It's okay to be nervous about changes, about having a new family. But Ethan's gaze was unyielding. He could see the truth in Emily's eyes, the practiced mask, the cold calculation lurking beneath. She wasn't the loving woman everyone thought she was. And he knew it. He'd seen it all too clearly, when no one else had. "It's not that," he said firmly, his voice small but steady. He glanced at his father, his expression pleading. "Dad, she's not who she says she is." A murmur swept through the crowd. David's brows knitted together in confusion, and he turned to Emily, then back to his son. "Ethan," he began slowly, "that's a serious thing to say. Emily's been nothing but kind to us." "No, Dad," Ethan insisted, his voice stronger this time. "She's only kind when you're around. When it's just me, she's different." Emily's eyes flashed dangerously, her sweet expression slipping for a brief moment. "David," she interjected, letting out a shaky laugh. "I think Ethan's just having a hard time adjusting. I've tried everything I can to make him feel welcome." "No, that's not true," Ethan interrupted, his courage flaring. He looked around at the guests, some of whom were nodding sympathetically, as if they'd seen a boy simply resisting a new stepmother. "I know you think I'm making this up, but I've seen things, I've heard things." David's face softened with a trace of sympathy, but there was a shadow of doubt there, too. He glanced at Emily, whose eyes filled with feigned hurt, her mouth twisting in a sad smile. "Sweetie," she said softly, "I know this is hard, but I'm trying to be a good mom to you." "No, you're not," Ethan cried, his voice rising with frustration. His gaze burned into her, defiant. "I heard you, Emily, talking to someone on the phone. Talking about my dad, about money, about hurting him." Emily's mask slipped just for a moment, but it was enough for Ethan. He knew he'd struck a nerve. He looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would believe him. His eyes landed on his father, whose face had paled. David swallowed, his voice unsteady. "Emily, what's he talking about?" Emily's laugh was hollow, sharp. "This is absurd," she scoffed, casting Ethan a contemptuous glance. "David, he's just a child with an overactive imagination. I've been planning this wedding for months, working so hard to make this day perfect. This is his way of acting out." But Ethan wasn't done. He felt his courage building like a fire inside him, stronger with each second. "I saw your laptop, Emily," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "You were looking at life insurance policies. And there were pictures of you with someone named Mark." Emily's face drained of color, and for the first time, her practiced composure cracked. A look of raw panic crossed her face as she took a step back, eyeing the door, as if ready to bolt. David caught the movement, his gaze hardening. "Emily," he said, his voice low and cold. "Tell me the truth, right now." Emily forced a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "David," she whispered, her voice thick with barely concealed rage. "I can't believe you're even considering this nonsense. You're really going to take his word over mine?" David's silence was answer enough. Ethan watched, his heart pounding with fear and hope. As his father's gaze finally hardened, the last traces of doubt falling away. "Ethan's never lied to me before," David said, his voice breaking, "and I'd rather believe him than risk being wrong." Emily's face twisted into a snarl, her facade of sweetness falling away completely. "You little brat," she spat, her voice laced with venom as she glared at Ethan. "You've ruined everything." A stunned gasp rippled through the crowd, and David's face registered pure shock as he took a step back, horror dawning on his features. In that moment, he finally saw Emily for who she truly was, and his heart shattered. "Emily," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "I want you to leave. Now." Emily's eyes blazed with fury, her face a mask of hatred as she glared at both David and Ethan. With a final look of contempt, she whirled around, her white dress trailing behind her like the ghost of what could have been. She strode down the aisle, pushing past the stunned guests who stared after her, some frozen in shock, others whispering in hushed tones. Ethan felt his father's arm wrap around his shoulders, pulling him close. David knelt beside him, his voice hoarse. "Ethan, I'm so sorry, I should have listened to you." Tears pricked Ethan's eyes as he looked up at his father, feeling the weight of everything he'd held inside finally start to lift. "It's okay, Dad," he whispered, his voice choked with relief. I didn't want you to get hurt." David hugged his son tightly, as the realization of how close he'd come to a disastrous choice settled over him. They held each other, oblivious to the guests around them, lost in their own moment of love and understanding. In that embrace, Ethan knew one thing with unwavering certainty: he had done the right thing. And for the first time in months, he felt safe. The quiet of the house felt thick and heavy as Ethan sat on his bed, knees pulled to his chest, his mind swimming in the storm of emotions stirred up by the events of the day. He knew he should feel relieved he had stopped the wedding, had saved his father from Emily's cruel deception, but instead, a new feeling crept in: guilt. He closed his eyes, images flashing through his mind like scenes from a movie. He remembered every moment he had seen through the mask Emily had so carefully crafted. Each small detail that had whispered the truth he couldn't ignore. The first time he'd met her was an autumn afternoon, crisp and golden. His father had been so excited, practically bouncing with joy as he led Ethan into the living room. "I've got someone special for you to meet," David had said, grinning from ear to ear. Ethan, unsure, had peered over his father's shoulder to see a woman standing by the window, the sunlight catching in her golden hair. She looked perfect, almost unreal, like a model in a magazine. Her smile was wide and warm, and Ethan wanted to believe it was genuine. But there had been something else in her eyes that day, something fleeting and unplaceable. "Hi, Ethan," Emily had said, kneeling to his level, her blue eyes twinkling. "I've heard so much about you. Your dad says you're a pretty amazing kid." Back then, Ethan had felt a small surge of hope. Maybe she was as nice as she seemed, maybe she could make his dad happy. And he had tried. He'd even shown her his favorite book, rambling on about space and planets as they sat together one evening. But instead of sharing his excitement, Emily had simply smiled politely, her gaze drifting elsewhere, almost as if she were bored. Then, the small cracks began to show. Ethan remembered one night, sitting across from her at the dinner table. His dad was working late, and it was just the two of them. He'd tried to start a conversation, to bridge the awkward silence that stretched between them like an invisible wall. "Miss Emily, do you like space?" he'd asked, his voice hopeful. "We're learning about planets in school." But she'd cut him off, not even looking up from her phone. "Ethan," she'd said sharply, her tone cold, "eat your dinner quietly, please. I'm busy." Her words had stung, a sharp contrast to the warm, motherly way she acted around his dad. In that moment, he'd felt a strange, unsettling feeling, like he was intruding in his own home. From then on, Emily's treatment of him grew colder, more indifferent, and sometimes even mean. She'd make little remarks when they were alone. Words that seemed harmless enough but always left Ethan feeling small and insignificant. "You're such a handful sometimes." She'd sigh if he made a mess during a project or got a poor grade. "I don't know how your father manages." And yet, when his father was around, she transformed. She'd laugh at Ethan's jokes, ask him about his day, and even pat his head affectionately. Ethan had tried to tell his dad about her, to explain the two-sided nature of her personality. But David never listened. He was lost in his happiness, wrapped up in the idea of love and a future together. But what haunted Ethan most of all was a night he'd overheard a conversation that changed everything. He could still remember creeping down the hallway in his pajamas, feeling thirsty and restless. As he reached the living room, he heard her voice, low and tense, as she hissed into her phone. "Mark, we have to wait. The wedding's in a few weeks," she'd whispered. "After that, we'll be set." David has no idea. Ethan had frozen, his small hands clenched into fists as he tried to understand her words. What was she planning? Who was Mark? And why did she sound angry? Her words had chilled him. But he didn't dare tell his father, not yet. He felt like he was holding a dangerous secret, one that could explode at any moment. And in the days that followed, he became a silent observer, watching her every move, noticing details he hadn't seen before. Her constant texting, the strange way she'd look at him when his father wasn't around, and the conversations she'd have late at night with someone saved in her phone as M. One night, he'd seen her searching through insurance policies on her laptop, something he only caught because of a reflection in the hallway mirror. He'd felt his stomach twist as he read the words accidental death, indemnity, and payout. The terms didn't make full sense to him, but he understood enough to know that she was planning something dark. He had felt helpless, weighed down by secrets too heavy for his young shoulders to bear. Even when he tried to bring it up with his father, his words always fell flat. His father's love and trust in Emily too deep, too solid to be shaken by a few scattered accusations from his son. But today, as he'd stood at the altar, watching his father beam at Emily with so much love and faith, Ethan had realized he couldn't stay silent any longer. He had to stop the wedding. He had to save his dad. A knock on his door jolted Ethan from his thoughts. David stepped into the room, his face softened with concern. "Hey, buddy, can I sit with you for a bit?" Ethan nodded, moving over to make room. David sat down, wrapping an arm around his son's small shoulders, pulling him close. "Ethan," David said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. I was so blinded. And you tried to tell me, didn't you?" Ethan looked down, guilt tugging at him. "I didn't want to ruin things for you, Dad. I thought, maybe it was my fault. Maybe I was imagining things." David hugged him tightly. "No, Ethan, none of this was your fault. You were looking out for me, for both of us. I should have listened to you." They sat in silence, the weight of the evening settling around them. Ethan felt a sense of relief, knowing his father finally understood. But there was also sadness. The memories of every painful moment, every hurtful word from Emily, lingered like shadows. "Dad," Ethan said quietly, "I thought I was going crazy. She was so different when you weren't around. She'd say mean things and she didn't even care." David closed his eyes, the guilt washing over him. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I should have seen it. But I promise you, from now on, I'll never let anyone make you feel that way again." In the dim glow of his bedroom light, Ethan leaned against his father, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in months, a sense of safety he thought he'd lost. As David held his son, he felt a renewed determination rising in him, a fierce protectiveness that would guide him forward. Emily had tried to come between them, but in the end, she had only made their bond stronger. And for the first time in a long while, David knew that they would be okay. As he tucked Ethan in that night, David whispered, "From now on, it's just you and me. Kiddo, you're my world, and I'm so proud of you." Ethan drifted into sleep, his heart lighter, his mind free from the shadows that had haunted him. They had faced the storm together, and somehow, they had found the light again. The days after the wedding felt surreal, as if Ethan and his father were moving through a world turned upside down. Their house, once warm and welcoming, now seemed to echo with Emily's absence. Her deception clinging to every room like a lingering chill. David and Ethan spent more time together, sharing quiet conversations and hesitant laughter. But beneath it all was a sense of hurt and disbelief that neither could shake. Ethan woke one morning to find his father sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. David looked up as Ethan padded into the kitchen, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, buddy," he greeted, patting the seat beside him. "Sleep all right?" Ethan nodded, but he could see the tired lines around his father's eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. "Dad, are you okay?" David gave a half-hearted chuckle, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, kiddo. I thought I knew Emily. Thought I could trust her, and I nearly let her hurt us both." He let out a deep breath. "But we're okay now, and we're going to stay that way. I promise." The silence that followed was thick, but it was also comforting. Ethan leaned his head against his father's arm, feeling the steady warmth that was finally starting to push away the lingering shadows Emily had left behind. Over the next few days, Ethan's mind kept returning to everything he'd overheard. Every strange look, every cruel word. He realized there were so many pieces of the puzzle he didn't understand. So many questions that haunted him. Who was Mark, really? How long had Emily been planning this? And, most terrifying of all, what would she have done if he hadn't stopped the wedding? One afternoon, he found his father working in the garage, replacing an old light fixture. "Dad," Ethan asked, his voice hesitant, "can I talk to you about something?" David put down his tools and turned to his son, a gentle smile on his face. "Of course, Ethan, what's on your mind?" Ethan took a deep breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I was just thinking about everything. About Emily. I don't understand why she wanted to hurt you. And I can't stop thinking about all the times she was mean to me when you weren't around." He paused, looking down. It's like I don't really know what was real." David knelt beside him, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. "I know, buddy. I've been asking myself the same questions." He took a deep breath, his voice heavy with regret. "I wanted to believe she loved us, that she could be part of our family. But people like Emily, they're good at pretending. They say and do all the right things until they get what they want." Ethan looked up, his brow furrowed. "So, what did she want?" David hesitated, the words coming slowly. "Money. Control. People like Emily, they think only of themselves. She saw our family as a way to get what she wanted. And she didn't care who she hurt along the way." As the days turned into weeks, David and Ethan began to piece together the clues Emily had left behind. A trail of small, scattered details that slowly painted a picture of her true intentions. David reached out to the police, providing them with the information Ethan had discovered, the suspicious life insurance policy, the hidden conversations, even the documents Ethan had managed to glimpse on her computer. One evening, Officer Johnson stopped by the house, a stack of folders in his hands. He and David sat at the kitchen table, and Ethan quietly listened from the doorway, his curiosity piqued. "It's not just you, Mr. Matthews," Officer Johnson explained, his tone grave. "We've been looking into Emily's background. And it seems she's done this before. She's a con artist, a professional. There are records of her being involved with several other men, each of them wealthy, each of them left with nothing when she disappeared." David shook his head, the shock evident on his face. "How could I have been so blind?" Officer Johnson offered a sympathetic look. "Don't be too hard on yourself. People like her, they're skilled at what they do. They know how to manipulate emotions, how to make people trust them." He paused, glancing at Ethan, who was half hidden in the doorway. "And if it weren't for your son here, things could have turned out very differently." Ethan felt a surge of pride, but it was mixed with something darker, a lingering fear that hadn't quite left him since the wedding day. "What about Mark?" he asked, stepping fully into the room. The officer's expression darkened. "We believe Mark is her partner in these scams. He's been involved in several of her schemes, always working in the background, helping her cover her tracks." "Have you found him?" David asked, his voice tense. Officer Johnson shook his head. "Not yet. He's a ghost, disappears whenever we get close. But we're keeping an eye out. And we've alerted other departments. He turned to Ethan, a kind smile softening his expression. You did an incredibly brave thing. Ethan, it takes a lot of courage to speak up like that. Ethan nodded, feeling a flicker of pride, though it was tinged with the weight of everything he'd been through. He realized that he'd spent so much time trying to protect his dad that he'd barely had a chance to process his own fear. That night, Ethan lay awake in bed, his mind racing with the details he'd learned. His father had told him they were safe now. But he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out in the shadows, Emily and Mark were watching. Waiting. It was an irrational fear. He knew, but it clung to him, lingering in the back of his mind like an uninvited guest. As the moonlight filtered through his window, Ethan resolved that he would protect his father. No matter what. He'd already stopped the wedding, saved his father's life, but if Emily or Mark ever came back, he would be ready. The next day, David decided to do something to help them both move forward. Ethan, he said, holding out a fishing pole as they stood by the lake behind their house. What do you say to a day of fishing? Just you and me. Ethan's face lit up, the darkness lifting as he took the pole. They spent the afternoon casting their lines, laughing together in a way they hadn't in a long time. It felt like they were reclaiming their lives, casting off the shadows that had haunted them. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan felt a warmth return to his chest. He was still afraid, but he knew that as long as he had his father by his side, they could face whatever came next. They were survivors, bound by love, and they would protect each other, no matter what. A crisp autumn chill settled over the town, leaves swirling down the quiet streets as though whispering secrets of their own. For weeks, David and Ethan tried to settle back into their lives, clinging to the familiarity of routines. School, work, dinners together, it was almost normal. Yet beneath every small joy, every shared laugh, lay the unspoken weight of Emily's betrayal. But tonight, something felt different. Ethan sensed it as he lay in bed, the usual nighttime sounds fading into an uncomfortable silence. He turned over, staring at the faint glow of his clock, which read 11:17 p.m. Unable to sleep, he crept downstairs, where he found his dad seated on the couch, staring at an old family photo. Lost in thought. Can't sleep either, huh? David asked, noticing Ethan approach. He set the photo aside, giving his son a weary smile. Ethan climbed up beside him. I keep thinking about her. I know she's gone, but I don't know. It feels like she's still here, watching. David wrapped an arm around him. I know, buddy, I feel it too, but we're safe. She can't hurt us anymore. But in that moment, they heard the faint crunch of gravel from outside, a subtle sound that shouldn't have been there at this time of night. David stiffened, glancing toward the window. Stay here, he whispered to Ethan, his voice a thin thread of calm. He rose slowly, his face tense as he moved toward the window and peeked outside. The yard was blanketed in darkness, but a shadow moved near the hedges, a figure barely visible in the faint glow of the streetlight. David's heart pounded, his instincts firing on high alert. He had always dismissed his suspicions, chalking them up to paranoia. But tonight, he knew he wasn't imagining things. Dad, Ethan whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Is it her? Is it Emily? David shook his head, signaling Ethan to stay quiet. I don't know, he murmured, though the thought terrified him. He grabbed his phone, dialing the police, but kept his gaze fixed on the shadowy figure. Please come quickly, he whispered into the phone. Someone's in my yard, I think they're watching us. Minutes felt like hours as they waited in tense silence, each rustle of leaves, each creak of the house amplifying their fear. And then, headlights cut through the darkness as a patrol car pulled up, the blue and red lights illuminating the yard in flashes. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the area with flashlights, and David ushered Ethan back, keeping him safely inside. They watched from the window as the officers circled the house, combing through the hedges, the yard, even the garage. Finally, one of the officers knocked at the door. David opened it, his face tense. Did you find anyone? The officer shook his head. his expression serious. We found footprints leading around the side of the house. But they disappear near the road. Whoever it was, they were careful not to leave much evidence. He paused, glancing at Ethan, who was watching him with wide, anxious eyes. We'll increase patrols in the area and keep an eye on things. You've been through enough, Mr. Matthews. David nodded, his hand on Ethan's shoulder. Thank you, officer. After the police left, David locked every window and double-checked the alarm system. But even with the extra security, sleep remained elusive. He lay awake, every creak of the house keeping him on edge. A reminder that shadows could linger in even the brightest of places. The next morning, over breakfast, Ethan finally voiced the question that had haunted him all night. Dad, do you think it was Emily? Or maybe, Mark? David looked down at his coffee, the dark liquid swirling as he gathered his thoughts. I don't know, Ethan, but I won't let them hurt us. Not again. Determined to reclaim a sense of safety, David decided to reach out to Officer Johnson that day, hoping for more updates on Emily and Mark. The officer listened with a furrowed brow, his expression grave as David recounted the previous night. We're doing everything we can to locate them, Officer Johnson assured him. We haven't found Emily, but we have more information on Mark. He's been seen in a few nearby towns, though he slips away every time we get close. I'd say there's a good chance he's trying to stay in the area. Watching you, waiting for the right moment to act. David felt a chill run through him. And Emily? Is she with him? Johnson sighed, his face grim. If she is, she's staying well hidden. But don't worry, Mr. Matthews. We have patrols watching your neighborhood. Just stay alert. And if you see anything at all, don't hesitate to call. That evening, David sat Ethan down, explaining everything Officer Johnson had shared. We're going to be extra careful from now on. Okay? No going outside alone. And keep the doors locked at all times. If you see anyone or anything suspicious, you tell me right away. Ethan nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. He knew what was at stake. They were still being hunted. Still in the crosshairs of a man who cared only about money and revenge. The days that followed felt like a tense waiting game. Each morning, David and Ethan checked the yard, the doors, the windows, even the trees for any sign of intrusion. And each night, they lay awake, their hearts pounding at every sound, every distant bark of a dog, every crunch of gravel. Then, one night, just as Ethan was drifting off to sleep, he heard a faint tapping at his window. He shot up in bed, his heart racing, his hands clutching the covers. The tapping came again, more insistent this time, and he felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. He crept toward the window, peeking through the blinds. Outside, just barely visible in the moonlight, was the shadowy figure of a man tall, with dark hair and a scar above his left eyebrow. Mark. Ethan's breath caught, his pulse pounding in his ears. He ducked away from the window, his mind racing. He needed to tell his dad, needed to call the police. But fear rooted him in place, his heart hammering so loud he was sure Mark would hear it through the walls. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the tapping stopped. Ethan dared another look, just in time to see Mark retreat into the shadows, disappearing down the street and vanishing into the night. Ethan sprinted to his father's room, barely able to get the words out as he gasped. Dad, I saw him. Mark. He was outside my window. David's face turned pale as he pulled his son into a tight hug, his mind racing with both fear and fury. We're calling the police. Right now. The officers arrived quickly, scanning the area, searching for any sign of Mark. But as before, he had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the lingering fear of his presence. As the officers reassured them of increased security, David realized something he had been reluctant to admit. Mark wasn't going to stop. He was watching, waiting, biding his time, and they would need more than just vigilance to stay safe. The next morning, David made a decision. He and Ethan would leave town, go somewhere far away, if only for a little while. They needed distance from the shadows, from the fear that had taken root in their lives. As they packed their bags, Ethan felt a surge of both relief and sadness. He loved his home, but he knew that leaving was the only way they could truly be safe. And as they drove away, he glanced back at the house. A sense of finality settling over him. They were no longer running from the shadows, they were taking back control. Reclaiming their lives from the darkness that had threatened to consume them. But even as they drove further from the town, from the life they'd known, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Somewhere, out there, Mark was still watching, and the final confrontation was yet to come. The next morning, David and Ethan left town, the familiar streets fading in the rearview mirror as they headed into the unknown. They drove in silence for the first hour, the weight of their fear hanging between them. The plan was simple: find a quiet, out-of-the-way place where Mark couldn't find them, a temporary refuge until the police tracked him down. David glanced at Ethan in the passenger seat, his small hands clenched on his lap. He looked out the window, watching the landscape rush by. But David could see the tension in his son's face, the haunted look in his eyes that he had hoped wouldn't follow them here. "How are you holding up, buddy?" David asked softly, breaking the silence. Ethan shrugged, his gaze never leaving the passing scenery. "I just keep thinking about him, about what he might do. And I keep wondering." He hesitated, glancing at his father. "Dad, do you think he'll ever stop?" David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Yes, Ethan, the police are close. They'll catch him. And until then, we're going to stay safe. You don't have to worry. I won't let anything happen to us." But as reassuring as the words sounded, even David knew the truth was more complicated. Mark had vanished once, slipping away from the police with a skill that suggested years of practice. He wasn't the kind to give up easily, especially not with the kind of hatred and anger that had twisted his motives. After several hours of driving, they arrived at a quiet cabin nestled at the edge of a dense forest. It was simple, rustic, just the place for a fresh start, a break from the fear that had overshadowed their lives. David unlocked the cabin door, the scent of pine and fresh air filling the space, and he felt a small sense of relief, a feeling that maybe, finally, they could rest. The cabin was cozy, with creaky wooden floors and a fireplace that seemed to promise warmth and comfort. Ethan's eyes lit up slightly as he explored the small rooms, a hint of his usual curiosity returning. He pressed his hands to the windowpane, looking out at the towering trees that surrounded them, his breath fogging up the glass. "Are we safe here?" he asked, turning to his father, his voice barely a whisper. David nodded. "Yes, buddy, we're safe. No one knows where we are. We can finally breathe." But the feeling of safety was fleeting. That night, as the darkness settled around the cabin, Ethan's fears returned, creeping into his dreams and turning them into nightmares. He awoke to the sound of the wind howling through the trees, every creak and rustle of the cabin amplifying his fear. Unable to sleep, he crept into the small living room, where he found his father, sitting by the fireplace, lost in thought. David glanced up, patting the seat beside him. "Can't sleep?" he asked, giving his son a soft smile. Ethan shook his head, his expression serious. "Dad, what if Mark finds us? What if he hurts you?" David took a deep breath, pulling Ethan close. "I know it's scary, but we're strong. We've already been through so much. And we're still here, and we're going to make it through this too. Together." Ethan nodded, letting his father's words settle over him, trying to absorb the calm and strength he saw in his father's face. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger, that no matter how far they ran, Mark's shadow would always follow. In the days that followed, they settled into a quiet routine. David taught Ethan how to start a fire in the small wood-burning stove. And they spent hours reading books, telling stories, and taking long walks through the forest trails. For brief moments, life felt normal again, as if the fear and uncertainty were nothing more than fading memories. But one afternoon, as they hiked deeper into the woods, Ethan stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on a faint trail of footprints leading off the main path. They were fresh, too large to belong to an animal, and they sent a chill racing down his spine. "Dad?" Ethan whispered, pointing at the prints. David's face darkened as he examined them, his pulse quickening. "We should head back to the cabin now." They hurried back, the weight of each footfall echoing in Ethan's mind like the steady beat of a drum. By the time they reached the cabin, both were breathless, casting nervous glances over their shoulders as they locked the door behind them. "We're going to be okay," David assured Ethan, though the worry in his eyes betrayed his words. "But we're going to have to be careful." That night, Ethan lay awake, his mind replaying every small sound from the forest, every creak of the cabin. He felt trapped, cornered, and he knew his father felt it too. They were safe for now. But Mark was close, lurking somewhere just out of sight, waiting for his moment. A few nights later, the quiet of the cabin was shattered by the sound of footsteps outside. David shot up, grabbing a flashlight, his heart hammering in his chest as he motioned for Ethan to stay behind him. They listened, every nerve on edge, as the footsteps grew louder, drawing closer to the door. David took a steadying breath and cracked open the front door, peering into the dark. "Who's there?" he called, his voice strong despite the fear in his eyes. There was no response, only the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, just as David was about to step outside, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Officer Johnson, his face grave, his uniform barely visible in the dim glow of David's flashlight. "Mr. Matthews," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." David's shoulders relaxed, but only slightly. "Officer, what are you doing here? How did you find us?" "We've been monitoring the area," Johnson replied, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear behind him. "We had a report of suspicious activity nearby. We think Mark might have tracked you down." Ethan's heart pounded as he listened, fear spreading through him like a cold wave. Is he coming for us?" Officer Johnson met Ethan's eyes, his expression serious. "We don't know, but we're taking every precaution. I'll be staying nearby, keeping watch. If Mark makes a move, we'll be ready." David nodded, relief mingling with dread. "Thank you, officer. I don't know what we'd do without you." The officer gave a reassuring nod. "Just stay alert, and if anything happens, call me immediately." As Johnson disappeared into the night, David closed the door, pulling Ethan into a hug. They were not alone, not completely, but the feeling of safety was tenuous at best. They were still trapped in a waiting game, shadows lurking on the edges of their refuge. In the early hours of dawn, just as sleep finally began to claim them, Ethan heard the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping outside his window. His heart stopped, fear tightening his throat as he sat up, straining to see through the thin curtains. Outside, barely visible in the dim light, he saw a figure moving along the edge of the forest, slipping between the trees like a shadow. He couldn't see the face, but he knew it was Mark, watching, waiting, and for the first time, Ethan felt something other than fear rise within him, determination. He wasn't going to keep running, keep hiding. He was going to end this, one way or another. He turned to his father, his voice firm despite the terror thrumming in his chest. "Dad, we can't keep hiding. We have to face him." David looked at his son, a mixture of pride and sorrow in his eyes. "I know, Ethan, and we will, but we have to be smart. We'll face him together." They spent the day preparing, strengthening the doors, securing the windows, making sure Officer Johnson was ready to intervene. And as night fell, David and Ethan braced themselves, waiting for the inevitable showdown. Side by side, determined to end the nightmare that had chased them this far. They were no longer just running, they were ready to fight back. And this time, they would be the ones to decide how the story would end. Night fell quickly, darkness thickening around the cabin like a shadow that refused to lift. David and Ethan sat together in the living room, their eyes scanning every window, ears attuned to the faintest sound. A log crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the walls. But the warmth couldn't chase away the cold weight of anticipation. Outside, Officer Johnson patrolled nearby, his presence a small comfort but not enough to shake the sense that something was coming. That they were on the edge of a final, fateful encounter. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. But he kept his gaze steady, watching the forest through the cabin window. "Remember, Ethan," David whispered, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "Stay behind me if anything happens. We're in this together." But I need to keep you safe. Ethan nodded, but his determination had not wavered. He'd come too far, faced too much fear to back down now. He felt a strength he hadn't known was there. A sense of resolve that he was ready to protect his father just as his father was ready to protect him. A sudden snap of a twig outside the window brought them both to attention. Their bodies tensing as they listened. Waiting, David grabbed the small flashlight they had kept close, casting a beam across the room, illuminating every shadow and corner. And then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost gentle, as if whoever stood on the other side wanted to be invited in rather than break down the door. David tightened his grip on the flashlight, motioning for Ethan to stay back, though he could see the defiance in his son's eyes. Together, they approached the door, their movements slow and cautious. "Who's there?" David called, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of wariness. There was no reply, only silence so profound it seemed to fill the entire cabin. Ethan swallowed, his pulse loud in his ears as he glanced up at his father. His expression a mirror of David's own tension. Just when they thought the visitor had left, the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. David took a deep breath and slowly turned the lock, cracking the door open just enough to see a face looming in the shadows, the familiar, chilling face of Mark, his dark eyes glinting with a mixture of malice and satisfaction. "David," Mark greeted in a low, calm voice, his tone as casual as if he'd dropped by for coffee. "We finally meet face to face." David's grip tightened on the door. "Stay away from my family." Mark's smile was thin, mocking. Now, I don't mean any harm. I'm just here to talk. To clear things up. You see, Emily didn't get the chance to complete her work. And I think it's only fair I help her finish what she started." David's jaw clenched, fury and fear warring within him as he stepped out onto the porch, blocking Mark's view of the cabin interior, where Ethan stood, watching his father's every move. "Emily's gone, Mark. It's over. Whatever you're after, you're not getting it here." Mark's gaze flicked past David, settling on the small, shadowy form of Ethan just inside the doorway. His eyes gleamed with something dark, something menacing. "Ah, the little hero," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. "I've heard about you, Ethan. You were quite the nuisance to my dear friend Emily, weren't you?" Ethan met Mark's gaze, refusing to back down. "You can't hurt us. We're not afraid of you." Mark chuckled, a slow, mocking sound that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Not afraid? How brave. But you should be." His eyes flicked back to David, his voice turning cold. "You ruined my plans, David. I could have had everything. But now, thanks to you and your son, I have nothing." David took a step forward, his fists clenched. "Leave, Mark. The police are here, and they'll find you. Whatever you're planning, it won't work." Mark's face darkened, his smile fading. "You think I didn't plan for that? The police don't scare me, David. I'm smarter than you give me credit for." His hand slipped into his pocket, and for a tense moment, David braced himself, ready to defend his son. But instead of a weapon, Mark pulled out a small phone, holding it up with a sneer. "You see, I've been keeping an eye on you both, learning your little routines, waiting for the perfect moment. And now, here we are." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But you didn't make it easy, Ethan. I'll give you that." Ethan's fear evaporated, replaced by a surge of anger. He stepped out from behind his father, his gaze hard and unyielding. "You can't scare us, Mark. You've already lost." Mark's smile faltered, his confidence flickering in the face of Ethan's defiance. He took a step back, momentarily caught off guard, but his gaze remained fixed on David, his expression hardening. "Fine," Mark sneered, his voice a low growl. "You want to play hero, kid? Let's see if you're still brave when I'm done." He lunged forward, his hand reaching out for David. But David was ready. With a swift movement, he swung the flashlight, catching Mark across the jaw. Mark stumbled back, clutching his face, a snarl escaping his lips. The sound of footsteps echoed through the forest as Officer Johnson appeared, his gun drawn, his voice commanding. "Freeze. Hands where I can see them." Mark froze, his hands slowly rising as Officer Johnson approached. His expression a mixture of rage and frustration. The officer quickly cuffed him, reading him his rights as Mark glared at David and Ethan with a hatred that burned bright and fierce. "You haven't won," Mark hissed, his voice filled with venom. "This isn't over." But as Officer Johnson led him away, his words faded into the night, replaced by the quiet sounds of the forest. The whispering leaves, the soft breeze. David and Ethan watched in silence, the weight of relief settling over them like a warm blanket. David turned to Ethan, pulling him into a tight embrace. "It's over, Ethan," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "We did it. We're safe." Ethan hugged his father back, feeling the tension drain from his body, the fear that had gripped him for so long finally releasing its hold. For the first time in weeks, he felt free, unburdened, and safe. As the dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a soft light over the forest, they stood together on the porch, watching the first rays of sunlight spill over the trees. They had faced their darkest fears, and together, they had emerged victorious. And as they walked back into the cabin, ready to rebuild their lives, Ethan knew one thing for certain: he and his father were unbreakable. The sun rose with a soft golden light, spilling through the forest and bathing the cabin in warmth. For the first time in weeks, Ethan and David slept peacefully, undisturbed by shadows lurking outside or the haunting memories of Emily and Mark. The cabin, once filled with tension and fear, now held a sense of calm and healing, as if the walls themselves had absorbed their relief. Ethan woke first, blinking at the morning light filtering through his window. The weight that had pressed on his chest every night was gone, replaced by a feeling of safety, of possibility. He lay there for a moment, savoring the simple peace of the morning before slipping out of bed and heading into the kitchen. David was already there, sipping a cup of coffee and staring out the window, his expression thoughtful but calm. When he noticed Ethan, he smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached his eyes. "Morning, buddy," he greeted, pulling out a chair for Ethan. "How'd you sleep?" Ethan returned the smile, sitting down across from his father. "Better than I have in a long time." David reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's. "Me too." There was a warmth in his gaze that hadn't been there before, a sense of peace and pride that filled the space between them. They had survived something terrible, something that could have torn them apart, but instead, it had brought them closer together. As they ate breakfast, they talked about everything and nothing, their voices light and easy, as though they were reclaiming every moment lost to fear and doubt. David shared stories of his own childhood, the silly things he had done with his friends, the dreams he'd once had. Ethan laughed, listening with wide eyes, feeling the bond with his father deepen with each word. After breakfast, they took a walk through the forest, the air crisp and refreshing, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The world felt brighter, alive with possibilities that had once seemed so distant. Ethan breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the cool morning air, feeling the last remnants of fear fade away. "Dad," he said, breaking the silence as they strolled through the trees, "do you think things will go back to normal now?" David thought for a moment, his gaze scanning the horizon. "I think we'll have a new kind of normal," he said, his voice steady. "We've been through something big, something that changed us, but I think we'll be stronger for it. And no matter what happens, we'll face it together." Ethan nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him at his father's words. They walked in silence for a while, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filling the spaces between them, a comforting rhythm of life moving forward. When they returned to the cabin, Officer Johnson was waiting, leaning against his patrol car with a relaxed smile. "Good morning," he greeted them, nodding in appreciation. "You two look like you had a good night's rest." David nodded, shaking the officer's hand. "Thanks to you, we did. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Officer Johnson waved it off with a kind smile. "Just doing my job. But I do have some news." He glanced at Ethan, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Mark is in custody, and he's facing charges that will keep him behind bars for a long time. You don't have to worry about him anymore." A surge of relief washed over Ethan, and he felt his father's hand squeeze his shoulder. The nightmare was truly over. The shadows that had followed them were gone, replaced by the bright promise of a new beginning. As Officer Johnson turned to leave, he looked back, his expression thoughtful. You know, Ethan, what you did, not many kids would have had the courage to stand up the way you did. You saved your dad's life. And I think you'll find that kind of bravery will take you far in life. Ethan felt his cheeks flush with pride. But more than that, he felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over him. He hadn't thought of himself as brave. Not really, but he knew now that courage was something that grew out of love for his father. Love for the life they shared. That night, as they sat by the fire in the cabin's cozy living room, David handed Ethan a small notebook. Here, he said with a smile. I thought you might like to keep a journal. You can write down everything we've been through. Or anything else you want to remember. Ethan opened the notebook, running his fingers over the blank pages, feeling a spark of excitement. He thought about all the things he could write stories about their time in the cabin. The memories they'd made, the lessons he'd learned about courage and resilience. And so, he began to write, filling the pages with words and sketches, capturing the journey he'd taken with his father, the fears they had overcome, and the bond they had forged. In his journal, he recorded the small details of their days, the laughter they shared, the promises they made to protect and cherish each other. Days turned into weeks, and soon, it was time to leave the cabin, to return home and rebuild their lives. As they packed their bags and locked up the cabin, Ethan felt a sense of bittersweet nostalgia. The cabin had been a refuge, a place of healing, but he knew they were ready to face the world again. On their way home, they stopped at a lookout point, the valley stretching out below them, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. David and Ethan stood side by side, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. This is our fresh start, David said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. No more fear, no more looking over our shoulders. Just us, building a new life. Ethan nodded, feeling a swell of hope and excitement. They had faced the darkness and come out stronger. And now, with each new day, they would create a future shaped by love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between father and son. As they drove the final stretch home, Ethan leaned back in his seat, his heart light, his mind at peace. He had learned that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the determination to stand up for what mattered most, no matter the cost. And as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, twinkling like tiny beacons of hope, Ethan knew that no matter what lay ahead, he and his father could face it together.